Hello and welcome back to our broadcast on exploring implicit bias in the history social science classroom. We're focused now on Module 1 using inquiry in ethnic studies. And now we're here with Michael Sabin in Part 3, helping students interrogate primary and secondary sources. Michael walked us through Part 1 where he gave us an overview of ethnic studies and inquiry. We finished Part 2 where he delved into using compelling questions to engage students and disrupt narratives, which of course is happening, of course, in good history classrooms, but of course in ethnic studies. So now we're moving forward through the inquiry arc in Part 3, helping students interrogate primary and secondary sources. Michael Sabin is a dear friend and colleague, very experienced classroom teacher from LA Unified, and a real teacher leader in the community as well. So thank you, Michael, again. Looking forward to Part 3.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad to be here. As we consider, again, inquiry in the ethnic studies context of a history social science classroom, we want to make sure that we are considering the entire arc of inquiry. In parts 1 and 2, we took a look at compelling questions. We took a look at multiple lenses that we can help students explore to understand the greater aspects that within the content. And in this part, we're going to be taking a look at dimension 3. And that is really evaluating those sources that they're reading and using evidence to draw their conclusions from those sources. Dimension 3 is one after compelling questions, which is my favorite. Having students analyze sources is one of my favorites because it allows students to really think critically about materials. As they gather evidence to answer that compelling question, they're questioning, again, the evidence. And so they're not just questioning content. They're not asking issues about identity or equity or justice. They're also questioning the texts that appear before them. And of course, that is the important skill not only of a historian in historical thinking, but it's also an important skill of informed citizens.
For all of us today.
All of us.
With so much information flooding into our phones in front of us. Yes.
All the time. And knowing how to approach that and knowing what questions to ask, what to look for are, as you say, valuable skills for all of us. And if there is one skill that I really want students to take away from my history social science class and ethnic studies is to question. Question everything, look at those sources, assess the reliability, come up with their own answers, not just what is being told. This dimension is also represented in the model curriculum as well as social practices for social justice critical practices for social justice education. But that is students should be exposed to a variety of primary and secondary sources. And when we think about that, oftentimes we bring in a lot of primary sources for students to look at, and then the textbook might be the only secondary source that students are looking at. But that textbook may not have other perspectives within it. We'll talk about how students can analyze and assess primary sources, but also we'll spend some time looking at how they can evaluate and be critical of secondary sources as well, and look at multiple domains. Part of this process is that they are forming their own conclusions. And that's what the inquiry is about, forming their own conclusions. That they're based on evidence, that they are going to then in dimension 4, that we'll talk about in the next part, about how to communicate those and take action based on the issues that they see have been raised in that content. And also think about how these topics, about how these issues, about these texts that are before them are in conversation with other texts that they've read, other issues, other events. So they're seeing a broad perspective of history and also of ethnic studies issues and themes that permeate history social studies curriculum.
So I'm reminded of the world today, of course. You know, we're kind of, most of us in the habit of following a news feed that has one particular perspective and pretty much validates our own personal belief and moral systems. How many times do we challenge ourselves to watch a different news feed that might have a different perspective or line of thinking before we form our own? That's part of media literacy. It's probably something we all need to focus more on, because the more we see our own views of the world validated, affirmed, they become more hardwired, unfortunately, and unable to look at that other perspective. So if we start this in history class, we start this with ethnic studies, hopefully that will transfer to the world we're all facing now.
Absolutely. And I think that it goes to exactly that point of asking questions about this. What am I seeing here? My compelling question that takes me into viewing my news program or reading the journals that I'm reading, how can I expand that question to include what are other people saying? What are other people thinking? What are other perspectives that I'm not considering? And so, but I agree with you. It's very much more comfortable for us to remain with one perspective.
Yes, in our own little comfort line of thinking.
Correct.
Yeah.
But that's why this dimension 3,
so important,
is absolutely critical, and teaching students how to be informed consumers of information through this process of inquiry, but also, again, to draw their conclusions from that based on the evidence. And that's why within the K-12 environment of ethnic studies, as well as history social science, we want to make sure that students are seeing issues from multiple points of view, and that the diverse stories and opinions are represented even within groups, that there are multiple stories that are being told, but making sure that we're remaining within the realm of inclusion, that we're not just doing this to represent, well, here is something way out there that you should represent. We're thinking about conclusion and humanizing the discourse so that it is respectful of and celebrating those contributions of all. Thinking about that also, that it is structured so that students are examining these materials from multiple perspectives, but in a structured fashion, not putting forward multiple sources and then having students be awash in information. But how can it be structured in a way that they're asking questions, that they are critically involved with the texts so that they can bring their
So we
conclusions.
hear our friend Sam Weinberg talk a lot about this, thinking like a historian.
Yes.
Yes, and that's the crux of his work in looking at that, asking those questions.
Absolutely. And we want to bring in sources also that are bringing in all the stories, all the narratives, in a way not so that students, oh, well, here's another perspective, but that students are also seeing themselves in that narrative and considering how they can then look at those sources and how those sources reflect or speak to their identities and how they can understand that their identity is represented, but other identities are also represented. And this is challenging, and we'll talk about it. Where do you find these sources? But we'll talk about some ways that you can do that. But that is also, I think, next to, perhaps this is why it's one of my favorite dimensions of inquiry. It's very challenging to create really good, compelling questions. It's very challenging to find multiple sources from multiple perspectives that represent multiple stories.
That are reliable, too.
That are reliable.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
I agree. This is really challenging. People ask us all the time, can you just give us a list of these things to find? It does take some investigation. The textbooks, I think, generally are getting better about providing them, but we know we can dig in and find others. We could do a whole college course on just one aspect of history and really peel the onion apart. So what's a teacher to do, all right? Where do we find them? How do we select them? What's appropriate? Help us.
Okay.
Come on, you have the answers.
Oh, I have some answers. I would start, well, first off, there are wonderful resources that are available online. I'm just going to say the textbook is great.
And some not so wonderful,
some not so wonderful. So we would talk about also the reliability of the online resources.
Yes.
A source, for example, if you're teaching U.S. history, Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration, organizations like Gilder Lehrman Institute are going to have a wealth of resources that are free. You're not going to be paying for these things. And that will present, and even every day, even when I visited the Library of Congress recently, it was remarkable how much information is in there, how many documents are there covering the broad spectrum of American experience from multiple perspectives, multiple ethnicities represented. And so it was overwhelming almost. But those kinds of resources, reliable resources, are available online. For world history, Fordham University has the Internet History Workbook. Again, multiple representations of events and issues from multiple perspectives around the world and from multiple times of history. Those kinds of reliable online resources take you well beyond the textbook, and those are important. I would certainly talk to colleagues who are facing the same struggles that you are in that. Where are you getting, what sources are you using? How are you having students, what documents are you having your students look at? How are you having them look at those documents? The library media teacher and even a public librarian will be able to help you with that also, identify further information. But I would absolutely say go to your students, go to their families, go to local community organizations. They will have sources of information also from perspectives that you may not have considered. I know that my students always were very generous in sharing sources of information, documents, books that were part of their experience. And that is a really important part of ethnic studies.
Some oral histories too.
That's right.
Local histories are good
That's
too.
right. Down the street from my school was the Islamic Center for Los Angeles,
Oh my.
who they
what
were
a
so
resource.
generous
Yeah.
with their time and resources, not only with documents that students could read, but sending speakers to speak to my class. And so those kinds of community resources, again, are a wealth of information that I would encourage.
So I'm thinking about when we studied the civil rights movement, didn't just occur in the southern states.
That's right.
Here in California, you can find local examples of events, people working on both sides of that issue too.
That's
yeah,
right.
Makes it very local and doable.
And there are community organizations that will have resources, that will
Yes.
know about things.
Yes.
I'm thinking about, yes, Los Angeles. Any major city will have these kinds of organizations and community services and resources available. And my experience has been that many of those also have websites. They have an online presence, so that if it may not be available in your particular community, it will be available online. But again, it's the reliability of
Good.
that source.
All right, good. Take us through this part.
Primary source analysis. Again, when students are faced, this is one thing that teachers historically have found challenging, and rightfully so, because it is difficult to have students really understand the steps that they need to go through for sourcing a document, recognizing bias within that document, assessing the reliability of that document, corroborating the information with another document that may not have the same perspective on the same event.
For sure.
And that. And so there are multiple tools that are available. The California History Project has the primary source toolbox for analyzing, or the 6 C's of primary source analysis. Library of Congress has a nice tool that's
They
available
do.
online. National Archives and Records Administration, amazing worksheets to assess and analyze multiple different types of primary sources. Again, these are available online. They're free. They're great for guiding students through the steps that they need to think about when analyzing these sources. But more than just for reliability or historical accuracy or things like that, from an ethnic studies perspective, we want to, again, think about these kinds of questions. Well, whose story is being told here? Whose story is left out?
Yeah.
And this is a critical practice of social justice education. Or if the story is being told, how reliable is this perspective of this story that is being told from this perspective of this person who is not part of that community? Who are they to tell this story? Thinking about if the information is stereotyped, is it selective? Is it biased? Are there other sources of information that this is not addressing? For example, were there other events that are not represented? Were there other ideas that are maybe not playing part of this document that I'm reading? And where can I find that information? It may not be readily available. It may take some digging, but having students just raise that question, like, well, this is only one perspective. And if there are no other perspectives, if there are no other documents, questioning that, well, why is that? And what does that tell you about that history of that community? So those are the kinds of questions in addition to this more traditional type of primary source analysis that you want to guide students through, but think about those other questions.
Yeah, good ones for sure.
Yeah.
All right, talk about this. There's a great tool I know that you're aware of. I'm excited for you to introduce that.
Okay. Thank you. In addition to primary source analysis, students are to look at a variety of secondary sources also. Unfortunately, secondary sources are often just as unreliable and biased as primary sources.
Give us an example of a secondary source versus a primary source, just to clarify the difference.
So the primary source might be a letter written during the Civil War by a combatant in the Civil War. Secondary source is going to be the textbook or the historian writing about the Civil War far later.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so but the problem is that historian wasn't there during the Civil War or the event that's being represented. The historian may not have, even if it's a more recent event, may not be from the same community or have the same lived experience as somebody who is participating in whatever the event is. And so we have to really question that secondary source for multiple domains. And the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center came up with this wonderful document for assessing curricular materials.
Yes.
And they identify 7 domains that teachers really need to think about when looking at secondary sources.
So they're opening those textbooks or summaries of events. What does it ask them to look for?
Well, first thing is invisibility. And that's, we've said it so many times. Who's there, who isn't? Who is poorly represented? Who is completely excluded from the narrative that is being presented?
Yes.
And I would also add why. Are there reasons why there might be an exclusion from that? Are there stories being intentionally dismissed or downplayed? Stereotyping. Is it an oversimplified, simplistic view of an individual or of a group that minimizes or dismisses the individual contributions or the other experiences or the other realities of those groups that are there? Imbalance and selectivity is another one. And this is where oftentimes I understand textbook. I would hate to be a textbook writer.
It's a tough job, yes.
Especially for, like medieval history, if we talk about Western medieval history, if we talk about world history from the perspective, 1,000 years, okay, and I have 1,000 pages or fewer to write all that, I'm going to be selective. I'm going to probably be imbalanced with what I present because I want to give the shortest account of indeed the most complex event.
Yes, because you're not writing a college textbook, which
That's
is
right.
a sliver that can go very deep. You're having to cover a whole lot of time.
That's right. And so textbook publishers do leave out a lot. And unfortunately, those complex issues can be very selective in the points of view that they represent and the perspectives. Or it's just like, oh, well, there are 5 perspectives, I'm going to give 2. And so they're selective, but they're selecting which perspectives to represent.
So we have to watch for that.
You do have to watch for that, and how can it be expanded? How can those other perspectives and points of view be introduced? Historical whitewashing is a real issue. It's a real problem with textbooks where troubling events, troubling issues are the vocabulary that is being used. They are represented in ways that dismiss or disguise violence, oppression, racism, prejudice, and to make it more palatable with the view that, children, they don't need to know. No, we would argue that indeed there is a story that needs to be told.
Well, this is a big issue happening in many states right now, we're seeing.
That's correct.
Without calling any state out in particular.
That's correct.
But we've long known, too, even the way different regions in the country address the Civil War and what they even name it for. I know for many years it was called the War of Northern Aggression by a number of southern states versus a civil war. So just even the naming of events has important implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that does go, to that question of whitewashing. What we term something, what we call it, can be more palatable than the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And again, especially when it comes to issues of violence, for example, and downplaying that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real issue. Fragmentation and isolation is another domain.
Yeah, talk about that.
So that's where you might have a group, a cultural group, that is visually or textually separated from other groups, as if there's no interaction between the two. So, for example, a textbook talking about the antebellum South may say, here's a chapter on the antebellum South people. Part A is about the planters. Part B is about the enslaved population, as if there's no interaction between the two.
Mm-hmm.
The pictures may show enslaved populations working side by side, but completely eliminate or make invisible the planters in that scenario. And so that is really fragmentation. You're fragmenting the text. You're isolating them as if the two groups never met. They never had any kind of interaction between the two. And it's a way, actually, it's a real issue. It's a real problem. And interestingly, in the workshop that we did most recently on implicit bias, where we took teachers through an analysis of their textbooks that they used, in this particular textbook, the teachers noticed that the pictures of Europeans were actual representations of people. The pictures that were to represent the indigenous populations were of implements, tools, things that they made. And there was never any attempt to really depict or show that this population as being human. They were artifacts. And so, and I understand that there were no cameras back then, but nevertheless, there are things that could be done to address that. But that's an example of kind of fragmentation. Linguistic bias is another domain to look at. And linguistic bias, you do have to have an eye out for language within the text. Is it prejudice? Is it bias? Is it racist? Is it showing that? That may be something that's a little bit easier to recognize, although oftentimes you have to look at omissions also. What are they not saying about these groups? And so, and that can be if they're not talking about celebrating the cultures, or if they're just being depicted as victims, as you had pointed out earlier.
Cosmetic bias, what is that?
Cosmetic bias. This one is great. So if you get this textbook and it says, it won't say this, but these materials are 100% bias free. That's a red flag. They're never going to say it like that. But if they are really working to say, we have done everything in our power to make sure that these materials are free of bias, free of prejudice, free of historical, they may be doing that to sell the book. It may not mean that they actually took those actions with the books. So you want to think about, is it promoting itself as being something that is free of all of these issues that come up with secondary sources? Because it's likely that even the best, the most unbiased attempt is still going to have some of these issues. So cosmetic bias, if they're making it look good to sell, and that's where I would go more for like commercial products to look at, as opposed to perhaps, if you're getting something from a community organization or something from a university.
Well, Dr. Brian T. Marks, we've had him talk many times about implicit bias, and he says no one is free of it.
That's right.
He basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, if you have a brain and you live in society, you're going to have bias.
That's right.
And it's not always your fault. It's just what's being imported into your brain is creating that type of bias. So recognizing it, admitting it, helps us move forward.
That's right.
I think that the textbook publishers are trying hard to do better. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree.
I'm thinking about the ones I used back when I was in school.
Yes, I agree.
They're getting better.
I
They're
agree.
getting better. And now with these tools, we know how we can enhance that to bring in other ideas if we feel that there's lacking there. But no, I do. I feel for them too, like you do.
Yes.
It's a big task, a big undertaking. And they have to appeal to a number of different audiences and regions across the country.
That's right.
Yeah, it's hard work.
And that's why, though, this tool can be helpful. Teachers, especially if you're looking at something like, a domain like invisibility, Because I agree, yeah, how do you tell everybody's story?
Yeah.
But if the students are critical consumers of this and understand, it's like, well, wait a minute. The example of the Civil War and who fought in the Civil War. Asking that question, well, who's not there? Well, I don't know. I don't see, Native people.
You don't know what you don't know.
Well, that's right.
You don't know what to ask.
You don't know. But if you ask that, it's just like, well, if you don't see Native peoples, well, did they participate in the war? Let's find out. And so we can expand that, but if they know what to look for. And that's why this tool that we introduced with the teachers, and it is linked in the educator's guide.
Yes, good.
The teachers found it especially valuable because it gave, in a very objective way, the types of things to look for in these kinds of materials. And based on, this is all based on research. And again, it's subjective. It's just like, no, I don't see this here. And so if that's a way for you, and I would even introduce these concepts to your students to, again, raise those questions. Well, if I'm seeing this, or this appears to be, imbalanced, or this appears to be selective, or this appears to be historical whitewashing, then what more can I do? What else can I bring in? And especially in a unit of inquiry, that's what you want. Can you do this with every page of a textbook? Absolutely not. Nobody has time for that. But in the unit of inquiry, if you're bringing in a secondary source, you want the students to question and analyze that source every bit as much as that primary source.
Yeah, so you're reminding me of something else. So many things coming to mind. I'm a big fan of the national parks, but there's a lot of backstory to those as well. The displacement of Native peoples. I just saw something, I think the National Park Service is really working hard to really capture other voices. They have something there around how Chinese Americans were responsible for building a lot of the roads leading into Yosemite National Park, right?
Yeah.
The role of Chinese Americans in the Transcontinental Railroad. Is that story part of it? That was the backbone. That was the labor force that built that railroad too. Yeah, these are great tools, and I'm really glad you found that one from about analyzing the textbooks and looking for those biases. Wonderful. I wish I'd had that when I was in the classroom. And I agree. I think teachers are excited about that. I'm glad we can offer it to people to use.
I'm going to add just one little to the national parks.
Yes.
When we talked about combatants in the Civil War and Asians and Pacific Islanders, the national parks has a document that is free, a booklet, it's about 100 pages, about the contributions and the combatants in the Civil War who were from Asia. And it's interesting because it's difficult to assess the numbers, because where are the records to really assess how many people were here, how many people were fighting, and the estimate of the number of Asian Pacific Islanders east of the Mississippi in the U.S. beginning of the Civil War, it's about 200. Doesn't seem like very many. And yet the estimate also, and these numbers are not accurate and 100% reliable, but the estimate is that about 50 participated as combatants in the Civil War. 25% of the population. That's right.
Jumped in.
That's right.
Why?
So
now you've got me curious. All right, now we're getting into history geekdom here,
Yes,
Michael. We could go on all day. But no, all of that stuff is just fascinating, There's also stories. I just finished a book of a Latino coalition in World War II that were sent to Europe and did heroic, amazing work there.
Right.
When do you see those stories too, right?
Exactly.
That stuff's just powerful.
And that's maybe when the question like, who were the combatants, does get it compelling.
Yes, but you're right about National Park Service. Manzanar, Japanese internment, is run by National Park Service, a great place to visit with lots of stories, narratives to be told. All right, we should get going.
We should.
Where are we at now? Evaluating sources on the template.
Right. So if we look at that inquiry-driven lesson template, again, it does ask students, like, how are you going to have the students evaluate and analyze these multiple sources? Adding the ethnic studies perspective to that is you want to make sure that the students are looking at multiple sources from multiple perspectives, which you would anyway.
Yes, we talked about
but also, and have how the students analyze those. But again, those important questions. Who's here? Who isn't?
Right.
Where's the stereotyping in both primary and secondary sources? Is it selective? Is it whitewashed? What are we looking at for that? So
Great tools. Great tools, great guidelines. And yeah, I think it's great for ethnic studies, but even for history education. I'm also wondering what this approach might look like in an English literature class, or maybe even a science course or math classrooms.
well,
Be
I'm just going to
interesting to
say
see.
that tool that we talked about
Yes.
for assessing curricular materials is not limited to history, social science textbooks.
I
It was
bet
written
that'd be
for
interesting.
all curricular materials.
Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. I'd love to have that conversation with those teachers, see what they discover. Yeah. Because
Yes.
like ethnic studies doesn't sit in just one classroom.
That's correct.
It's a holistic look at education writ large.
That's right. That's right.
So, all right. Part 4. Tell us the last dimension, what we're going to look at in part 4.
Well, this is where the rubber hits the road.
Yes.
This is where students communicate their conclusions to the compelling question. And they, after they have gone through all of this work with assessing, looking at an event or an issue from multiple perspectives, and then looking at multiple resources, they come up with their answer to that question and identify issues that are current and affect them and impact their communities, and identify actions that they can take to
That's
address
right.
those issues.
And that's why we study history, and that's why we focus on ethnic studies. So
That's right.
thank you for part 3, Michael. Looking forward to our examination of part 4 on communicating conclusions and taking informed action.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.